we're going to see the rise of self-styled prophets, um, religious leaders, different ways of reacting to this foreign control. A lot of it is actually, and so the gamut of religious leaders will run from Muslim caliphs, Christian visionaries, traditionalists. It's a very interesting period from about the 1850s, well, actually about 1800s to about 1914. And so this is what we are calling the alternative visions of the 19th century. In other words, how do people react to this encroachment, but also not just foreign control, but also how do people react to industrialization? For example, how does Marx, or what does Marx say would be a way for people working in factories for 18 hours a day? What does he propose that they should do? And so we're going to see a lot of political reformers. On the one hand, we see the growth in wealth, wealth and literacy. As industrialization is going on, societies are trying to figure out, while the parents are working, okay, maybe we shouldn't be working kids to death, but what should we be doing with them? And so literacy is increasing. Industrial revolution has also increased the availability of literacy resources, more trade, so people have an improving sort of quality of life. Life expectancy is still actually very low. And so we want to see how these ideas, including, for example, popular sovereignty, political power. So one of the things that we see, for example, in Britain is the organization of labor and suffrage, so the agitation for voting. And then we see another idea, the rise of the nation state as an idea. People begin to think of themselves as British, French, Germans, and so we see consolidation based on this, what we will refer to as nationality, and then the ideas of democracy. But we want to say that ideas of democracy are only predominantly reserved for actually minority populations. So, for example, white men in this country, or colonial the colonialists in places like India. So in elections, for example, in India, you have about maybe 1 million people voting out of about 300 million. So we're seeing increase in free trade, free markets, unregulated markets, free labor. And so this is the decline of slavery. It became clear that people worked better if you paid them instead of work them to death. And so in places like Brazil, you see labor, free labor working alongside slave labor, but more broadly. For example, the Industrial Revolution is primarily driven by free labor. In terms of literacy, we are seeing newspapers and broadsheets. This is before television or radio or even the telegraph or the telephone. But we are beginning to see people thinking of themselves as these groups of people. And so we are going to see a lot of protest movements. We are going to see, as I mentioned, prophets, political radicals, common people, leading these protest movements to challenge the 19th century order based on capitalism. In colonization, colonial peoples are rising up, but also people who agitate for a voice in government. So, for example, in Russia, you're going to see radicals rise up, other groups of people, for example, people we call nihilists, who believed that no government was better than any government. But also, we are going to see the triumph of organized government over most of these movements. So even though there's protest movements, eventually governments prevail. sometimes with a lot of bloodshed. But we also see the questions of what are these alternative movements? What are they preaching? Are they egalitarian? So, for example, in China, you're going to see a very interesting movement that is actually egalitarian, that advocated for social justice, that advocated for equality for women, property ownership. So while they have some weirdness in them, some of them are actually social justice based, but there are also others that urge a return to some purity. So, for example, a lot of movements that were opposing simultaneously colonialism, but also suggesting that society should go back to an earlier time. So, for example, you're going to see Native American movements that say, well, the reason that white men came and took over is because Native Americans moved away from their traditions. And so if they went back to their traditions, then they might be able to even defeat the white men. So you're going to see quite a number of revolutions, and we'll talk about some of these in the places where they occur. I want to mention that some of the revolts that have occurred, especially in China, in East Asia, have had some of the highest deaths. And so, for example, the Hui Muslim was towards the west. We have talked about western areas of China and being predominantly Muslim dominated. And so you actually see some of these Muslims, for example, the Hui Muslim revolt, being against the idea that people had to change their religions, for example, to adopt Buddhism. But actually, before the Hui Muslim revolt, we'll see the Taiping Rebellion, which has a death toll that is estimated at about 30 million. Now, the Taiping Rebellion ends in 1864, and again, you see the whole Muslim revolt begins in 1862, so they kind of go hand in hand. There'll be other revolts, for example, the Nian Rebellion, and so we're going to see quite a number of these revolts, people choosing to either follow their religion or follow both religion and ethnicity. But so I want you to keep in mind that these are periods of great progress for some. Again, think about this country and the place of African Americans. Political, social, economic development, but also revolutions that transform the 19th, 18th, and 19th centuries, imperial expansion, new nation states, but also these nation states are expanding over people. So what is the place of these people? How are people opposed to the expansion of European colonialism, capitalism, extraction of natural resources, taking over independent nations, but also the denial of freedom. So, for example, colonialism was obviously a denial of freedom. Now, I want us to remind ourselves that in some of these places where colonialism is taking over, we have seen the decline of certain empires. So, for example, the Ottoman Empire is declining. We've talked about how, for example, the Ottoman Empire is being taken apart by the British and then the French, but also internal rebellions. For example, Egypt becomes an independent country. And so the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires begin to decline. And so, for example, the British colonialism of India occurs where the Mughal Empire used to reign. And so sort of think about displacement, replacement, and we're not necessarily saying that, for example, the Mughal Empire ruled injustice. In fact, there was a lot of rebellions even in the Ottoman and Safavid and Mughal empires, but what replaces them is not necessarily any better. We also see the rise of new empires, for example, in West Africa, especially areas, for example, of Nigeria, Senegal, we are going to see these charismatic leaders who are creating alternatives to the European. And so some of this takes place in the periphery. So, for example, Senegal, you couldn't say was necessary in the global sort of the modern capitalist trade areas. But again, remember Senegal and the Niger Delta and those areas had already lost majority of their populations to slavery. And so it's almost like these leaders are both opposing slavery, but also what is replacing slavery, which is colonialism. So we do see an attempt to establish like full-scale theocratic nations. One of the individuals who did this, for example, Usman Dan Fodio, tries to put together a caliphate. We are going to see other West African leaders who do these kinds of things. And so we do see some rise of modern theocratic nations. They do not really succeed very well. We previously probably mentioned another place where we see the rise of a theocracy, today's Saudi Arabia. And so we see the mixture of, so it's useful to think about what kind of polities or communities existed in some of these places. For example, in Saudi Arabia, well, modern day Saudi Arabia, which used to be called Najd region. And so you have a tribal leader. And you have a religious leader. So the religious leader is Muhammad Wahab, that's him. And then you have Ibn Saud, who was kind of like a tribal leader. Now you want to remember that the Saudi Arabia is the home of Islam. It's where Muhammad saw his visions. And so this is where Islam begins. And so when you combine religious leader and a tribal leader, and they create this polity, it becomes a theocracy. Now, so this, so Saudi Arabia follows. There are two major branches of Islam: Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. These other smaller branches. And so Saudi Arabia follows the Shia branch of Islam, but the Saudi version of Islam is actually what we call Wahhabism, which is kind of an ultra, it's a different kind of Islam. For example, Syria follows Sunni Islam, but this is not really that fundamentally. So think about the treatment of women, place of women, and so on. And so, but this is the foundations of a theocratic state. We are going to see other theocracies in the Middle East. So, for example, Iran is often thought to be a theocracy that follows the Shia Islam. But again, so eventually we are going to see the modern formation of Islam by the, or rather of Saudi Arabia, by the descendants of Saud or Ibn Saud. And so this is actually, the Saudi state takes 3 attempts to try and create it. And so today, the rulers of Saudi Arabia are still descendants of Ibn Saud that still follow this branch of Islam. As we've mentioned, in places like West Africa, so West Africa was very interesting because it had, it followed elements of various religions, predominantly Islam, but also there were what a lot of scholarship calls traditionalist or animist African religions. But also remember, this is the first part that interacts with Christianity. So there's a hybridity of Christianity, Islam, and African traditions or African traditional religions. But in places like Nigeria, especially the northern parts where you see the Fulani peoples, you find that there was a lot of conversion to Islam. So, for example, Usman Dan Fodio is or creates an Islamic caliphate. Um, and so, if you actually sort of think about, so northern Nigeria was very interesting, still has some challenges even today. So, there were people who were pastoralists, so they kept animals. They kept animals. Some of them traded. Uh, but also they had been the people who were in the eye of the slave trade. And so there's quite a bit of disruption, but also modernity. And so people like Usman Dan Fodio tried to manage the trade, create empires, spread religious ideas across the Sahara, and generally tried to figure out how to resist Western encroachment. Um, and so, for example, Usman Dan Fodio becomes one of the Fulani Muslim leaders, and also calls himself a cleric and a prophet. And so he creates a very significant territorial empire in northern Nigeria. And so he actually then announces that people who refuse to convert would face jihad, or people who denounce Islam would face jihad. And you actually see quite a bit of this and so again, think about the spread of Islamic ideas in northern Nigeria. And so again, he is encouraging jihad versus unbelievers. He is targeting local leaders for failure to respect Islam. Gets a bit of support from the Hausa and the Fulani, and again, he's drawing inspiration from the life of Muhammad. Now, we can sort of think of him as one of those, as his is an alternative vision. In other words, how should the Fulani and Hausa communities organize their lives? So he's just creating a new, new empire. Um, Now, some of these new developments, so for example, creating a caliphate in northern Nigeria. Now, there's different extents to which these leaders are pushing certain ideals. So, for example, Fulani women were required, expected to obey Sharia law. And so, again, think about people who are not necessarily Muslims and what this implies for them. And so you see parallels between, for example, the Ottoman Empire requiring people to either convert, and for example, Usman Dan Fodio requiring women to obey Sharia law. Now, his daughter, Nana Asma, was actually very well known as an intellectual, as a fighter. And so, again, is this the role of women, or what is he sort of saying? Now, so he creates this theocracy in 1809, and so this was quite stable until the coming of the Europeans from about 1850 to begin to colonize these areas. And so this is an example of some of the places where we see the development of alternative visions of statehood. And so the north, you will see there's quite a bit of Islamic empire. So, for example, in Libya, in Algeria, in Nigeria, and so sort of look at where Nigeria. Actually, the Sokoto Caliphate forms where previously there was what was known as the Kanem Bornu. Now, From 1882 to about 1898, we also see the formation of a Mahdist state in Sudan. This one actually lasts a very short time because this is the period of time when the British and the French are colonizing the region. The Mahdi was actually defeated by the British and maybe murdered by them, I think. But so the important thing is that there are these formations of smaller kingdoms, not the not the Ottoman Empire, but alternative visions, Muslim kingdoms. But towards the south of Africa, we also see the formation of new forms of rulership. And so most of you will probably be familiar with Shaka Zulu. And so from about 1800, we see the growth of different kingdoms that arise from branches of the Zulu. And they are going to actually spread from the south of Africa, southern Africa, to almost the areas of Tanzania. And so when the British are coming to colonize this region, they're going to be running into these political movements that draw their inspiration from Shaka Zulu and his cousins, his followers, his people who are trained to fight by Shaka Zulu. And so this often are called Fesane movements. They had a very specific way of fighting. So, for example, one of the ways that they fought was generally referred to as horns of the bull. They used a very short spear. Well, actually, they had kind of two spears and a shield, a throwing spear and a short spear with which they kind of stabbed you when they were up close. And so these movements are going on at the same time as the British and the Dutch colonialists are expanding in South Africa. Remember, a while ago we talked about the Europeans and going around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa and establishing themselves. And then we begin to see the settlement of South Africa, for example, the Cape Province by the Dutch and later the British. So the Dutch were initially kind of the settlers, and then they are kicked out by the British, or at least they continued to disagree. The British eventually take over South Africa. But again, this is going to be the period of what we often refer to as the scramble for Africa, the colonization of Africa about 1880s. And so everyone is trying to demonstrate that they have some control over parts of Africa. So if you look at that map, the western part of Southern Africa, and if you've done any genetic ancestry stuff, you might see that most African Americans will trace their heritage to the western parts of Southern Africa. So that part is mostly controlled by the Portuguese. Now, they also control the region around Mozambique, but in between there is South Africa. And so South Africa is controlled by the Dutch and the British. But the Europeans are also striving to control the whole region. So, for example, the Dutch wanted to control the whole of Southern African region. And so while the Zulus are fighting to retain their traditional lifestyles, they are running into the British and the Dutch and the Portuguese. And so again, it's quite a melee in there. Now, importantly, these Zulu-inspired movements by the Bantu-speaking peoples are sort of loosely like you don't see a lot of empires. You see someone rise up, they control quite a bit of territory, like Shaka Zulu and his brothers and his followers. But then these were not like long-lasting hundreds of years of empires. And so Shaka, of course, is one of those. And so the person that most people actually know is like the grandson of Shaka, Setsuayo. He was actually pretty a big man. So Shaka had three sons, and his sons eventually will fight each other for control of the of the South African kingdoms. And so you actually see, for example, the Ndebele, the Nguni, the Sotho. So there were different groups, but they are still trying to sort of control or conquer other Bantu groups and to build bigger kingdoms. But again, they're also running into now, if you are a rival of the Zulus, you allied yourself, for example, with the British. But people kind of then didn't know that the British were trying to take over everyone, not just the. And so we do see these other warrior states. We see these other alternative visions of what countries could be or how people could organize themselves. Even though, for example, that didn't pan out for South Africans, they were eventually colonized by the British until about 1994. Now, let's look at other places where we see these protest movements. And so China is a place you've mentioned. We want to go back there. And so remember the extent of the Qing Empire, as big as it was, as productive as it was. There were occasional, periodic, frequent rebellions. And so these included, for example, what the Qing Empire was making people do, but also natural calamities, but also eventually just people feeling like they wanted some independence. And so things like opium bring instability, things like being the Qing Empire being unable to rule the empire, but also things like floods, periodic natural calamities, and how the Qing Empire reacted to this was often really, but also like the British would, encourage people to be in rebellion. So, for example, when the Taiping Rebellion begins, now the Taiping Rebellion was a Christian movement. And so, because the British are trying to take apart the Chinese, they are like, "Oh, we're going to support this Christian movement." And why are they being oppressed by the Qing Empire? Why do they not have the right to worship? Now, of course, these are ways for the British to weaken the empire, but the Taiping Rebellion especially was very interesting, and it was put together by Hong Xiuquan, who considered himself a prophet, and his decision to consider himself a prophet was very interesting because he apparently failed the civil service exam. The Chinese had a civil service exam, and so he fails 4 times, and then he starts seeing visions. These visions show him as or walking in a garden with an older man, white man, and so he interprets a vision to suggest that he was walking with the Lord and he was Jesus' younger brother, and now he was called to do something about these visions. And so he's like, "Yeah, I am Jesus' younger brother." So he decides that he's going to, he was sent to save the Chinese from evil. And he decides to start. This is why we should avoid cults. This was Jonestown all over. And so he starts preaching and converting people to leave the old ways of the Chinese, which is So, but again, he was preaching a message of revitalization in a troubled world, of course, of heaven, restoration, heavenly kingdom. He actually calls his kingdom the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And it was centered around Thistle Mountain. And so when the Qing decided that he was a troublemaker, he decided to move the kingdom up the mountain. Um, yeah. He had some. Now, although he saw visions and he had some weird stuff going on, his kingdom is actually said to have been egalitarian. So he preached equality of men and women. And you want to remember this is the time when in China, men or fathers decided what their daughters were going to be, who they married, what careers they were going to follow. And so now he's saying, well, women can be whoever they want, they can be whatever they want. But he declares himself the heavenly king of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. So, again, it's a little sketchy. And then he decides to actually fight the Qing. He calls them the devil, the demons. And so clearly, if you're a Christian, your whole job on this planet is to fight the devil and the demons. And so, yeah, so it continues growing. And so the Taiping, so they actually acquire weapons. They are given weapons, including by the British, and so they are able to fight the Qing Empire, the Manchu garrisons. Eventually, the Taiping Rebellion has a death toll of about 20 to 30 million. So again, these are lots of. Now you can see the territory that they controlled, and so they were kind of based on the Hakka and Han ethnic groups. But also during this period, we are seeing other rebellions going out in the West. And so, for example, we have talked about Xinjiang, where the Western side, where there were mostly Muslims. So Muslims are rebelling. Towards the north, there is another Nian rebellion. Um, and so then you have this Taiping rebellion. So if you think about China during this period, the Qing Empire is really beset by all kinds of rebellions, together with the British and all these other European powers that are trying to take it apart. Now, this does not necessarily maybe excuse or, yeah. So his first followers, as perhaps we might see with Christianity, came from the margins of society. And so again, sort of think about how these rebellions go. So the Qing were the focus, the object of the focus of the Taiping rebellion. So they are focusing their anger on the Manchus. And part of the reason is they're saying the social and economic problems are caused by the Opium Wars, and this is the weakness of the Qing. So obstacles or demons, the Manchus are demons, and so they are in the way of realizing God's kingdom, and so of course they need to be. But again, as in terms of equality, you see women were able to serve in the military, which in China generally they could not do. They could serve in the bureaucracy. Land was divided equally, so this is kind of a good thing if you are a Chinese woman, and it kind of appealed to you. Now, 100 years later, communism would say sort of the same things. In fact, one of the reasons that communism became so attractive to China was Mao said, well, women who do not like their husbands can get a divorce. Immediately, about 5 million women got divorces because they had been married by their fathers. And so now, Mao is like, we are all equal. You can make your own decisions. So again, think about how people at the margins of society can be brought in. And again, if you have nothing to lose, you really have nothing to lose. Now, there were other people who were in the rebellion. So, for example, Hong Rengan. Yeah, but eventually we see so there were actually three people who were like the major rebellion people, but Hong was the prince of the Heavenly Kingdom. Um, there were struggles within the leadership, but also codes of conduct. So, for example, one of the complaints was that people could not drink. I would think that Christianity doesn't generally allow people to drink, but yeah, but also, so the ethnicities of China, you remember there are 55. The Han, who are the majority, kind of didn't really side with the Hakka. They actually sided with the Manchus, and so this kind of took some of the sting out of the rebellion. But also, China was beginning to modernize its military and so on. And so, eventually, the Qing forces crushed the rebellion in 1864. But again, remember, then there was that other Hui rebellion. So, let's look at other places and how they were managing these new realities. So, for example, think about the Industrial Revolution that is now picking steam in literally in Europe, and sort of think about how um, some of the reactions to capitalism and the work conditions. And so we actually see the rise of all kinds of different groups of people. Some of the most widely considered groups included radicals, utopian socialists, abolitionists, religious mavericks. And so even within Europe, even when they didn't really start these religious movements, you see them beginning to articulate ideas that were often very interesting. So think about, for example, radicals, abolition of government in places like Russia. Think about people like, well, now abolitionists were about the ending of slavery, so that wasn't probably a terrible thing. But also, you find utopian socialists who are suggesting that they form these communities or communes where this will be self-sustaining groups. There are so people like Charles Fourier, or but also think about socialists and Marxists and some of their ideas and what they should perhaps, or what government or organization of society should be like. And so we begin to see all of these kinds of groups that begin. So, for example, the radicals, Jacobins, nationalists, and utopian socialists, especially France. So, we'll see that in France and Russia, we have the greatest diversity of political, social, and other thought. And so these arise, for example, from the Restoration period. So the Restoration period was from about 1815. So remember the killing of the French Revolution, the murder of the king, and then Napoleon. And so after 1815 and the end of Napoleonic Wars, it's sort of like, well, let's return France to something that makes sense. But then you see the rise of Jacobins, nationalists, and utopian socialists, and liberals, and reactionaries. And so France goes through all these kinds of challenges. And actually, in 1848, it's going to go through another revolution that brings, as we've mentioned, Napoleon Bonaparte's cousin into office. But we should not only blame the French or attribute these rebellions to the French. There were many other revolutions across France. So whether we are talking about the Holy Roman Empire, so Prussia, Austrian Empire, Germany, and so you can sort of see all these revolutionary activities in places like Spain, in France, especially, but also in Italy. And so the less organized society was, the more revolutionary activity we see. But we also see revolutionary activity even in Russia. Remember, for example, in 1825, there was an attempted coup in Russia to overthrow Alexander II. So there's quite a bit of revolutionary activity. And so you can actually look at maybe the 19th century as the age of revolutionary activities, not revolutions, revolutionary activities. These come with radical visions. And so radicals, whether they are suggesting that government is unnecessary, whether they are talking about various types of social control, whether they are Marxists, whether they are suggesting that there should be an abolition of private property, insistence on popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty is choosing your leaders. And so if you think about Europe until 1848, leaders are still divinely chosen. So people like Alexander II, Nicholas the First, of course, the French kings. So people still don't choose their leaders. They still this struggle between divine right of kings and whether people should choose their leaders. But of course, with the industrialization, the question of whether private property should be abolished, and especially with socialism and communism, the ideas of owning property together so that, some people are not getting wealthier and others are working for them full time. And so you see this sort of mishmash of thought. In the middle of this, we actually see the rise of nationalism. And so nationalism is actually traceable initially to the French, thinking of themselves as French, but also maybe to the Greeks. But we're also going to see it develop in places like France, in places like Germany. So people are thinking of themselves as Germans. In places like Italy, where they stop thinking of themselves as Venetians or Romans, they are thinking of themselves as Italians. And this is based on, and this is actually ironic because the nation was defined as people sharing common language, culture, and history, even though there were dialects. And so the broader idea is that you share common languages enough. And so in places like Switzerland has 3 languages. So how is Switzerland like a unified country? Belgium has 3 major languages. In Germany, of course, you have like all these regional dialects, but they are beginning to see themselves as Germans, and they are actually going to go to war over. And so this is another thing that happens between about 1850 to about 1900, and then they start going out to conquer other people. We have mentioned the Greeks, who were maybe the first to gain independence as nationalists. But then we are going to see later on people like who live in the Balkans, like the Serbs, begin to consider themselves Serbs, and so they want to actually assert independence. And of course, because of European grievances, for example, the Russians will support the Serbs because they want to take apart the Ottoman Empire. So there were like all kinds of challenges going on. Now, the communists and the socialists are probably the best known. And interestingly, communism and socialism, even though it was derived from ideas of socialist utopias, so communism really, or the Communist Party, is formed in 1848. Marx and Engels write the Communist Manifesto, and so they then, and so communism makes sense because, well, I can't believe I say that. Made sense in the context of what communists were trying to do. Because they were working for these owners of property, And so the whole idea was, if we owned the means of production, we would pay ourselves better, we would work less hours, and maybe society would be fairer. Interestingly, Friedrich Engels, who is the co-founder of communism and part of the duo that wrote the Communist Manifesto, his father owned a factory in England. And so in 1844, he actually writes a book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England, based on which some of the communist ideas are based. And so it's almost like he is stabbing his father in the back. But so the major concern was inequalities produced by industrial capitalism. And so some of these inequalities I think we can identify with, for example, kids working for up to 12 hours a day in, 5, 6-year-olds. And I don't know if that's necessarily, and then living in really terrible conditions, economic gap between the workers and the wealthy entrepreneurs and their employers. And so, yeah, so the idea is that the free market economy would eventually be transformed so that there was going to be fairness, equality, and so on. And so communism or socialism brings in all kinds of different workers. And so everyone is involved in answering what they call the social question. In other words, and you actually see very interesting people that you don't think were trying to answer this question or who are engaged with this issue. So, for example, J.S. Mill and his wife, the question is, what is the best form of production? Under what conditions can people produce best? The economies thrive best? Should people have equality? And so again, if you sort of think about other places and other movements, so for example, the Seneca Falls, so these were global movements trying to figure out, what are industrial relations between employers and employees? What should be the place of men and women in productive society? Should the place of women be in the home, or can they similarly produce equally? But then you begin to see changes, for example, in laws that ban women from working underground. And so is that an element of inequality, or is that like, should people have the right to work wherever they want to work? Or should women not work in mines, and maybe kids not work in mines because, well, black lung disease and mines would collapse and kill a whole bunch of people? So these are questions that everyone is involved in trying to answer. But also thinking about how government is responding to these questions. Like when people are protesting and government fires on people who are demonstrating peacefully. So again, these are not necessarily new things. But we also see the people beginning to organize. So for example, the movement that was called Chartism, People's Charter, comes from People's Charter. And so people are trying to figure out, so it goes from working conditions to, oh, by the way, we should be able to elect the government, and we should allow men to, men, no, yeah. So again, even when these debates are going on, for example, the Chartism movement suggests that there should be universal suffrage for adult males using the secret ballot. Again, women are not included, and we know that it's going to take another century for British American women to gain the franchise. Actually, it took until maybe 1990 for Swiss women to vote in national elections, which is like, why? So these have been, issues that have accompanied the worker movement and so on. And so again, you will see that this petition is rejected, but there were some changes that, so for example, in the number of hours. But again, as I mentioned recently, it wasn't until 1928 that the number of hours that a person, so the number of maximum hours was set at 8. and breaks put in there so that you took a break. And so some of the people who are dealing with this question, including Charles Fourier, who suggests utopian socialism. And again, you can begin to say, even though we are not talking about Christianity or Islam or some other religion, Charles Fourier believes himself to be the scientific prophet of a future world. And you would think that he's French, so maybe it makes sense. He hated merchants and middlemen, and so he is agitating for these self-sustaining communities. But again, he disliked division of labor and repressive moral conventions. So maybe he's like, well, like Hong Xiuquan, we should all work. And so it talks about order coming through organization, not bloodshed. And so he creates what he calls phalanxes, self-sustaining communities of about 1,500 people, and suggests that people should work in short spurts of about 2 hours. And then, well, this is probably not is a mean thing to do. He talks about the undesirable work should be left to adolescents. Not sure why he didn't like adolescents. But, again, if you sort of think about how some of those ideas transplant, so think about work, for example, in well, not food production, but say in areas like fast food, and who gets that kind of work. Yeah, so now this is what he thought a phalanx would look like. So it's like a community, self-sustaining community, and people are working in a commune. Now, later on, like in the 1970s, his ideas would be implemented by the government of Cambodia, where people would work in communes and they would produce food, and raising children was left to like a few adults, and the other adults worked in fields and industries and other things, which was kind of like, I don't know how people felt about being separated from their children. But yeah, so these are some of those ideas of the 1850s. Of course, Marxism. So Marxism is the sort of fairy godmother of communism. And so, as I mentioned, the condition of the working class by Friedrich Engels, materialist theory of history, there's a whole scientific arguments that are in. And so Marx was actually a university professor eventually, and so some people critique him for not having done an honest day's work in his life. But he was able to argue that the history of all production is class society, exploitative production, and rebellion against this production. And so, especially so he was very excoriating of slavery. In talks about now on that part, I think yes. And then he looks at British takeover of India, and he thought that eventually India would rise up and oppose British colonialism. But at that point, he was engaged in the question of the clash between wage workers, proletarians, and capitalists, ushering a brave new world. And he has this famous statement where he says the history, or he talks about proletarians having nothing to lose but their chains and a world to gain. But so he's telling people, you should go out there and protest. But he's not really there protesting because he's probably well employed. And so he thought that history would move through the stages of feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. And so people who study this now are like, well, it seems like capitalism adapted sufficiently to Now, he then looks at the revolutions of 1848. I previously mentioned the the European Spring of 1848, revolutions in France, Italy, Czechoslovakia, Austria that kicked out governments. But there's nothing to say that these were necessarily worker driven. In fact, they kicked out um, and so the one in France is the one that brings in Charles Napoleon III, and causes resignations in other places. But it's useful to sort of think about these revolutions. Now, on